In this video, we'll be showing you why a widow at 67 with $900,000 saved discovered her enough number wasn't enough to retire, and why it had nothing to do with the size of her portfolio. Through working with clients who have lost spouses and have had to rebuild their entire retirement plan, we've seen how becoming widowed changes retirement math overnight in ways no amount of savings automatically fixes. That's why we're making this video, to show you why the number you save doesn't determine your retirement, but the plan built around your new reality does. Let's get right into it. When Susan lost her husband, Mark, the retirement plan that they had built together didn't unravel slowly over time. It shifted all at once. And what makes this so difficult is that at first, nothing really looks different. The accounts are still there. The balances haven't changed. On paper, Susan still had about $900,000 saved for retirement. So from the outside, it feels like things should still work. Many people would look at that situation and say, she's probably fine. But this is where people get caught off guard. Because while balances don't change, the income underneath a plan does immediately. As a couple, Susan and Mark had built their retirement around 2 Social Security checks. Those checks formed the backbone of their income. Their portfolio was designed to supplement income, not replace it. So when Mark passed away, that structure disappeared. Susan didn't lose half of her savings. She lost half of her guaranteed income. Depending on the benefit amounts, that meant losing about $2,000 a month overnight. And that's where the plan they built as a couple stopped fitting Susan's life as a single retiree. From the outside, people still saw the same number, but that number hadn't changed. The job that money had to do did. This is where Social Security quietly becomes a turning point. Again, as a couple, Susan and Mark had 2 Social Security checks coming in every month. Those checks weren't just nice to have, they were the foundation of how their retirement plan worked. They paid bills, they covered the basics, and it allowed their portfolio to stay in the background. But when Mark passed away, that changed immediately. A lot of people assume the surviving spouse gets to keep most of the income, but that's not how it works. Susan was entitled to keep the higher of the 2 benefits, but the smaller one disappeared entirely. So they'd each been receiving around $2,000 a month. That didn't turn into $3,000 or $3,500. It turned into $2,000 total. That's a reduction of over $24,000 a year in guaranteed income. Nothing about Susan's lifestyle changed overnight, but her income did. And for the first time in retirement, she had to ask a different question. Where does the rest of that income come from now? And when you look at the plan, there's only one answer. It has to come from her portfolio. This is one of those moments where retirement planning runs into reality. Susan couldn't control losing a spouse. She couldn't control how Social Security survivor benefits are structured, and she couldn't control how much guaranteed income disappeared overnight. But what she could control was how the rest of her plan responded, and whether the decisions going forward were made intentionally or left to chance. This is where a lot of well-meaning financial advice starts to fall apart. When Susan became widowed, eventually people started saying things like, well, your expenses should be lower now. And on the surface, that sounds reasonable because there's one less person in the household, one less daily routine, and one less plate at the table. So the assumption is that the budget will shrink to match a person's income. But that's not how it actually works. You see, when Susan looked at her real expenses, the picture didn't line up with what people had expected. Her housing costs didn't change. The mortgage stayed the same. Property taxes didn't go down. Insurance didn't get any cheaper. And utility bills didn't get cut in half either. Even groceries, which people assume would drop dramatically, only declined modestly. When you add it all up, Susan's expenses realistically fell by only about 20%, but her guaranteed income had dropped by almost 50%. And that mismatch is where the pressure starts to show up. Nothing about Susan's lifestyle fundamentally changed overnight. She was still living in the same house with the same need for stability and independence. However, she was now facing a situation where income dropped sharply, but expenses barely moved. That's why a plan that works comfortably as a couple can start to feel tight almost immediately when one spouse is gone. And once Susan saw that gap clearly, another issue came into focus. And this is usually the point where people feel stuck. Not because the money is gone, but because everything feels uncertain all at the same time. You're grieving, you're afraid of making the wrong move, and you don't yet know which decisions matter most and which ones can wait. And that uncertainty is often more paralyzing than any spreadsheet. And if you're watching this and thinking, I'm not sure how this would work in my situation, that's completely normal. If you want, you can share a few details using the link below, and we'll send you a personalized retirement analysis video that walks through how your income, accounts, and taxes would interact, especially for your situation. For now, let's keep going. The IRA problem Susan didn't know that she had. Once Susan understood the income gap, the next question became obvious. Where does the rest of that income come from? Her instinct was to avoid touching her IRA for as long as possible. In her mind, the account was her safety net, right? Her long-term money, the account that you leave alone and let grow. And that sounds responsible. We see this moment often. It's when people are trying to be careful, but they don't yet realize that being passive here is still a decision. But this is where retirement planning as a widow behaves very different than retirement planning as a couple. If Susan continued delaying her RIA withdrawals, that account would keep growing, and that growth would eventually trigger required minimum distributions, whether she needed that income or not. And at that point, Susan wouldn't be choosing how much to withdraw. The IRS would. And those forced withdrawals would stack on top of her Social Security, increasing how much of that benefit became taxable and pushing her into higher tax brackets faster as a single filer than ever she would have if it happened as part of a couple. Now, the account that she thought she was protecting was actually quietly becoming a source of future pressure, not because the money wasn't there, but because of when and how it would eventually have to come out. And that realization is what changed the conversation here. At this point, it was clear that Susan didn't have a money problem, she had a coordination problem. The savings was there, the income sources existed, but the way that everything was interacting, that had to change. So instead of asking, is $900,000 enough? The better question became, how does this money actually need to work now? When Susan mapped out her essential and lifestyle expenses as a single person, her spending target came in at around $72,000 per year. Her Social Security survivor benefit would cover roughly $24,000 of that. That meant about $48,000 per year needed to come from her portfolio. And importantly, that income wouldn't come from a single account. It would be spread intentionally across her IRA, taxable savings, and cash reserves, each one serving a different role. Instead of treating all $900,000 as one pool of money, the plan shifted to purpose. Some assets would support income now, and others would be preserved for later years. And the IRA, which Susan originally wanted to avoid, needed to become part of the solution sooner, not later. The goal here wasn't to eliminate taxes. It was to decide when those taxes would be paid, instead of allowing future required minimum distributions to dictate those terms later on. By coordinating withdrawals intentionally, the plan could smooth income, limit future tax pressure, and create predictability. This is also where relief usually starts to show up, not because everything is solved, but because the decisions are no longer happening in the dark. That same $900,000 that just a few moments ago felt uncertain now felt defined because it was finally being used in a way that matched Susan's life as it actually was. Susan's situation, unfortunately, isn't all that rare. What is rare is having the opportunity to step back and rebuild the plan before that pressure fully sets in. Widows and widowers tend to learn a difficult lesson very quickly. The number that you saved doesn't determine whether retirement works. Plans built for two people don't automatically work for one. Again, Social Security changes, taxes change, and income behaves differently. And most people don't plan for this ahead of time, not because that they don't care, but because it's very uncomfortable to think about. When widowhood does occur, it often arrives with a lot of grief. And that's when financial uncertainty can feel the heaviest. Not because the math is impossible, but because everything feels urgent all at once. Susan's experience shows that retirement success isn't about predicting every outcome. It's about building a plan that can adapt when life doesn't follow the original script. Susan's story highlights something that's easy to miss when retirement planning is focused only on numbers. There are things in life that you simply cannot control. You can't control when a spouse passes away. You can't control how Social Security rules are written, and you can't control how the markets or tax laws will change. But there are things you can control. You can control how your income is structured, you can control which accounts are used and when, and you can control how much flexibility your plan has if life doesn't unfold the way you expect. That's what made the difference in Susan's situation. Nothing in her portfolio suddenly changed. What changed was the way that the plan had to respond to a life event that could not be predicted. If Susan's situation felt familiar, or if it raised questions about how your own plan would hold up under a major life change, that personalized retirement analysis video we mentioned earlier is available if you want a clearer picture of how your income, accounts, and taxes would work together. Until next time, take care.